From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power.
From Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew. It's the Thursday edition of the fastest show in politics. We're still at world headquarters. We're still waiting for some races to be called, specifically in the swing states of Nevada and Arizona. Senate races, House control still up in the air. But Kaylee, today we're talking about Joe Biden, who's calling to lower the temperature after bruising losses on Tuesday night.
Yeah, hearing some familiar language from Joe Biden as he spoke from the Rose Garden of the White House, talking about the victory of Donald Trump and repeating some things we've heard from him in the past, including that you can't love your country only when you win.
Campaigns are contests of competing visions. The country chooses one or the other. We accept the choice the country made. I've said many times, you can't love your country only when you win.
From the Rose Garden to Bloomberg's Washington Bureau, where we find Mike Dorning standing by from our Washington, D.C. studios. Mike, the president said setbacks are unavoidable, but giving up is unforgivable. He's telling people in the Rose Garden across the nation this as many Democrats blame him for Kamala Harris's loss. How do you see it?
Well, I think the president's trying to set up how history remembers him. There's a long tradition in American politics going back to George Washington of presidents using sort of farewell addresses to shape history's view of them and shape kind of a lesson they're trying to give the country going forward. Obviously, Biden has a lot to answer for from Democrats who feel like had he stepped aside sooner, they could have perhaps, possibly put a stronger candidate or a stronger campaign by the same candidate. Those are all sort of hypotheticals, and we don't know what would have happened, really.
Well, that's absolutely true. We also don't know for sure what will happen over the course of the next 74 days of this administration that he was talking about. There will be a lame duck session, both for him being a lame duck right now, Mike, and then a lame duck session, of course, for Congress. What realistically is going to be able to be accomplished between now and the inauguration on January 20th?
From Congress, most likely not a lot. They'll probably be able to come up with a solution to keep funding the government. Usually, after the election, you can come up with a resolution to that reasonably easy with a little bit of standoffs and gamesmanship. But there's a new power structure coming in. Everyone understands what that is, so that makes the negotiating easier. The other thing we'll probably see is the Biden administration continuing to try to get money out the door from these funding bills that are their priorities, because once it's out the door, you can't take it back.
That's a big part of the story right now, is how much Joe Biden can do for Ukraine, for instance, before he leaves office. There's still some money left in the $60 billion approved. Mike, should he start sending military hardware now? Could that be rescinded if Donald Trump wanted to pull it back?
The military hardware is something that's a little bit different than what I focus on. There are some things where it takes a while to get the military hardware over there, and I'm not exactly sure of the chain of custody, but he can't just send it out and it gets there right away.
Right.
My guess is even if it was on its way, it would be hard for Trump to stop it politically, even if he presumably could. But it doesn't even matter if a little more hardware gets over there. In terms of a war and a negotiation and strategy, Trump still has the leverage because they know whatever Biden gives them is short term. Trump's in charge in the long term.
Well, and Trump maintains that he can end the war in Ukraine in a single day. Of course, the first day of his administration, Mike, will be January 20th, and it will be a question of what he can accomplish on that first day in the first 100 days. What should we expect first?
I would expect you would see something on immigration and his campaign promise to do more about illegal immigrants, even if it isn't quite the mass roundups of millions of illegal immigrants right away or undocumented workers. They would do something quickly, and that's something that the president has the authority to do with a stroke of a pen. There are logistical impediments of, like, where do you put people that you might round up. But you would see something quickly on that. You might see pardons right away for January 6 protesters, because that's something, again, all you need is pen and paper and you can do. What will take longer, but will be something that they will probably get on top of, is tariffs and trade and taxes. On tariffs and trade, the president can do stuff on his own, but it takes a while. There's a process. It takes months to go through, but he can start that process quickly. It's core. The other thing is taxes. You'll see movement there quickly, but probably not a resolution for many months.
Joe Biden came to Washington in 1973 when he was elected to the Senate, Mike, and today was a bit of a farewell. I'm sure he'll have another opportunity, but that was a moment for him as part of the legacy building that you referred to when he spoke to the Rose Garden earlier today, as he talked about the accomplishments that I'm sure Republicans wouldn't reflect in quite the same way. I just wonder if you could speak to the career of this 81-year-old who finds himself in a precarious situation here, being blamed, at least partially, for a loss.
Well, I think actually probably in the coming months, there will be kind of a negative focus on Democrats are going to have an internal struggle, and he will catch a lot of blame in that internal struggle. But as time sort of elapses, it'll focus more on, as you were talking about, the broad strokes of his career. Someone who has always kind of represented the center of the Democratic Party. He's kind of moved to the more liberal side as the party has moved, but he has had a strong instinct at somehow sort of catching somewhere in the middle between the progressive wing of the party and the white working class people who were the origins of the New Deal coalition and were the backbone of the party for many years. And he is someone who also was the partner of the first black president. He's appointed the first black, or not appointed, chose the first black vice president. So he will be a part of the civil rights legacy of the Democratic Party in history.
All right, Mike Dorning joining us from Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios. Thank you so much for being here. And of course, as we consider that notion regarding civil rights and racial equality in the United States and the historic nature of Kamala Harris's candidacy, she, of course, will not become a historic president, but she will be a historic vice president at the same time. Some of these racial demographics we're paying close attention to in the outcome of these results. The swing we did see to some degree among black men for Donald Trump, but most specifically, a big swing in the Latino population of this country.
Yeah, it's a big reason we can, I think, say with credibility why Donald Trump won. The fact of the matter is, you're right, black men in the end did break largely for Kamala Harris, but she had lower shares of each constituency than Joe Biden did in 2020. And when you put it together, that was enough to be a problem.
Indeed. Well, we want to focus more on what's happening with the Latino vote and overall what the future of this administration and potentially the House could look like, and turn to Republican Congressman Carlos Gimenez. He represents Florida's 28th district, which includes part of Miami-Dade County, and he also used to be the mayor of that county. Congressman, thank you for being here on Balance of Power. First of all, congratulations on your reelection. If we could just focus on Miami-Dade, Donald Trump just became the first president to win that county, which has a population that is overwhelmingly Hispanic. Some 70% of the population is Hispanic. He won it the first time any Republican has done so since 1988. What does that capture to you? And do you think that is a permanent switch or just a moment in time?
I think it's a permanent switch. I think Hispanics here are moving more and more to the right. Why? Because the Republican Party represents the values of Hispanics. We're people of faith. We're people of family, hard work. We believe in the American dream. We don't believe in oppressive government or over government regulations. Those are the things that we believe in, and so that's where the Republican Party is, right now. And frankly, the Democrat Party has left many Hispanics, in their wake as they've gone more left and left and left. Also remember that many Hispanics here in Miami-Dade County in particular have fled socialism. We fled dictatorial regimes such as Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. And when we see the Democrat Party kind of embracing those regimes and also embracing some of their ideology, that's what caused the Democrat Party really to lose so many followers here in Miami-Dade County. We've also seen the independents swinging to the right too, and this trend has been going on for the last 8 years.
So walk back with us 2 weeks, Congressman. Was the whole uproar over the bad jokes told at Madison Square Garden, referring to Puerto Rico as a floating island of garbage? You know what came from that. We spent an entire week of talking about garbage on both sides of the aisle. Was that a media narrative? What about the corrosive effect that we all heard that this would have on the Republican ticket?
Look, Hispanics, we're not dumb. That was a bad joke by an idiot comedian in Madison Square Garden, but that's all it was. All right, President Trump certainly doesn't believe that. What was far worse was when Joe Biden, the president of the United States, called everybody who supported Trump garbage. That came right out of his mouth. That's far worse than what some idiot comedian said in Madison Square Garden.
So you didn't believe the cleanup on that? When Joe Biden tried to rephrase that, you think he meant it?
I heard what I heard, and so did over 100 million people. They heard what they heard too. And so the fact that he was trying to clean it up, and then he had some people trying to help him clean it up, that's also an insult to us. Okay, we're not dumb. We understand what he said. We understand why he said it, and so that was an insult to now the majority of the American people, obviously, because Donald Trump not only won the Electoral College, he also won the popular vote. And so obviously we didn't believe that retraction, as we didn't pay much attention to some comments about Puerto Rico. It wasn't funny, and certainly it did not reflect our ideals. Puerto Rico, they're great patriots in Puerto Rico. I have a number of friends that are from Puerto Rico. I love Puerto Rico. And so that was just a stupid thing to say by an idiot.
So that's what was heard by you and others last week. I'm interested as well, Congressman, in what you heard this morning. The Speaker, Mike Johnson, of course, had a call with members. And I'm wondering what projections you are getting from what is currently the majority leadership as to whether or not it is the expectation that you will stay a member of the majority.
Yeah, the leader and also all the leadership there expects that we will attain at least 218 and that we'll go beyond that. And so they're pretty confident in that number. And so, what I've seen, nothing that they said, gave me rise for concern at this point. I certainly would love to have a bigger majority. First of all, it's the majority, because the majority in the House is everything. Even if it's one seat majority, it's everything. And we need to have the majority, but they're confident that we're going to attain it. And so I have confidence in my leadership, and I believe that we will be the majority party in the House.
Well, before we get to the next session, let's finish this one, Congressman. What's this lame duck session going to look like? There were questions about, for instance, an emergency supplemental for natural disasters, the hurricanes that we saw. How about the farm bill? What can you get done before the end of the year?
Hopefully we can get done a lot. I'd love to get the farm bill through. Look, we're going to have to obviously talk to the president-elect and what the administration wants us to do, but we need to pass a continuing resolution to keep the government open. I have high confidence we will be doing that. Question is, how long? I'd say probably into the March-April timeframe. That way it gives us enough time, if we're in the majority, to put together the packages that we need to send on to the White House to start turning this country around and start implementing the policies of Donald J. Trump. And so, we're going to be working arm in arm, hand in hand with the Senate now that we control also the Senate. Look, if we control the House, the Senate, and the White House, we have no more excuses. We need to get to work. We need to deliver for the American people. We need to give them a break on high prices. We need to restore our energy independence and energy dominance. We need to restore our place in the world. And so all those things we need to do, and do it quickly. And we have to tackle the long-term problem of our debt. The national debt is running out of control, and our interest payments are higher than our payments for for our expenditures on national defense, we need to get that under control too.
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up, Congressman, because as you discussed delivering for the American people, I do wonder, with the debt and deficit in mind, if you think it's realistic to deliver on all of the promises that President-elect Trump has made when it comes to taxes and all of the tax breaks he would like to offer. It is likely to be deficit additive, and I wonder if you think that actually may make it more difficult to work its way through even a Republican House of Representatives.
Oh, we need to look at the revenue side of the House too. It's not just the deficit side of the House. I've always said that there's two sides to this. There's spending cuts that we have to implement, but there's also revenue enhancements. One thing that the president has alluded to already is that we have natural resources underneath our feet. For some reason or another, this administration has really hampered our oil and gas exploration and utilization. We should not only just be energy independent, which apparently we're not right now, we should be energy dominant. We should be using it to help our allies around the world and also to balance the imbalance in trade that we have. And so, yeah, it's going to be difficult to implement all these things, but we need to find the solutions. Look, one of the things that the president is really proud of is that when he makes a promise, he keeps it. And so I'm sure that he's going to, come to us and said, I made these promises. We're going to have to find a way to make sure that it doesn't increase the deficit. And I believe, here's what I think will happen. Because of these promises, we're going to have more growth, economic growth. And when you have economic growth, you also have additional revenue into the coffers, just like what happened during the Reagan era, where we had more money coming in, even though there was some tax cuts implemented by the Reagan administration.
Yeah, we had a long conversation with Joe Lavorgna about that right around this time yesterday, Congressman. We've got just about a minute left. What will happen in the energy market under the Trump administration, knowing that we're already at a record level of production now? How do you compel oil producers to pump more, having seen them burn so many times in the past and knowing their penchant for returning cash to shareholders?
Yeah, look, we need to have a stable energy policy and not one that goes up and down depending on the administration. And that's something that we're going to have to do with legislation. The executive branch hampers production or can increase production simply through the stroke of a pen, executive action. We need to make sure that those that are investing in energy production are assured of the long-term investment is going to pay off. What we need to do is actually start to supplant Russian oil and adversarial oil with American oil. The Iranians, we should be able to put sanctions on Iranian oil, Venezuelan oil, because those are our enemies, and we need to start sanctioning them so that we deny them the funds that they need in order to wreak havoc around the world. That's one of the things I would love to see the United States do.
Great to have you with us this week, Congressman. Let's meet up when we're back in Washington. Congressman Carlos Gimenez of Florida, the Republican, with us on Balance of Power. I'll have much more ahead on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, live from World Headquarters in New York. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew. Thank you for joining us on this Thursday. It, of course, is 2 days after the election in the U.S. in which Donald Trump will become the 47th president of the United States, something that was acknowledged today in a Rose Garden speech by President Joe Biden, who shared that he had called Trump to congratulate him on his victory and has pledged to oversee a peaceful transition of power. It was similar in language to what we heard from the loser in this presidential election, Vice President Kamala Harris, who delivered her concession speech at Howard University yesterday.
The outcome of this election is not what we wanted, not what we fought for, not what we voted for. While I concede this election, I do not concede the fight that fueled this campaign. I spoke with President-elect Trump and congratulated him on his victory. I also told him that we will help him and his team with their transition, and that we will engage in a peaceful transfer of power.
Now that we've heard from both Harris and Biden, we assemble our signature political panel. Rick Davis is with us, partner at Stone Court Capital, Republican strategist, alongside Jeannie Shanzano, Democratic analyst and political science professor at Iona University. Great to have you both with us here. Jeannie, Joe Biden said, we have legislation we passed that's just now only really kicking in. When he spoke in the Rose Garden, he seemed to suggest that we were just getting to the good part as he's now leaving the building. And Democrats are largely blaming him today, fairly or not, for the losses that Democrats incurred on Tuesday night. The idea is if he had simply left a year earlier, everything would have been different. Are they right about that?
Yeah, it's been sort of ugly to see on the Democratic side, but not unexpected. There's a lot of blame going on. I think Joe Biden does own some criticism for this. But, the blame doesn't fall squarely on anyone, either Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. Democratic Party contributed to all of this. I mean, just one example. When, 7 out of 10 Americans tell you they are not happy and think we're on the wrong track, it's probably not a good idea either to run the incumbent at 80 years old or to choose his vice president and hoist her on the American public and expect them to feel differently. So today, Joan Kaylee, I am saying that Kamala Harris is looking more and more like Hubert Humphrey, and that is not a good look.
No.
And nothing to do with what she's done, but the process by which Democrats did this. It's not a surprise that this happened. And so, we have to think hard about how we move forward. But we know now this is not the way. You don't put somebody on a ticket when people are this unhappy without a vetting process in terms of a primary.
But it's not even just about the presidential outcome, Rick. This election brought a rebuke of Democrats all up and down the ballot. They have lost the Senate. The majority still has yet to be decided with a few outstanding races, and they very well could have lost their ability to retake control of the House.
Well, I think you have to assume that right now the Republican Party is the majority party in the United States. Senator Hawley said about a year and a half ago when the Trump campaign was just starting up that the Republican Party is the party of the working class, multicultural voters of America. And you would have thought he was talking about the Democratic Party from 10 years ago. And so I think you can lay the blame all you want. There obviously plenty to go around, and I feel bad that people go through that because having been the victim of losing campaigns, it's never fun. But the reality is there's been a realignment going on since 2015 that the Democrats have done virtually nothing to even abate rather than turn around. And so Republicans really are the working class family party. If you look at the data, Donald Trump significantly increased his share of the vote in working class counties all across the country. But what has also happened, and it's not attributable to any one decision or any one candidate, is that he's made inroads into traditional Democratic constituencies, primarily because he was able to show that he could offer another alternative, having been president and actually having benefited these constituencies like, young working class blacks, young working class Hispanics. I mean, when you look at it, it's an economic model, not a cultural model that has shifted this campaign.
Well, it's interesting, Jeannie, because I'm hearing a lot of people say today that where were you guys for the last year? How come we weren't having this conversation before Tuesday? Hindsight's 2020, right? Everybody's an expert and a political analyst this morning. But should there have been a more concerted look at this issue? We've been talking about inflation since Joe Biden walked into the Oval Office. How else should we have been looking at this?
Well, so many of the assumptions turn out in the aftermath, as you mentioned, Joe, to be wrong. I'll just give you one example. The Democrats were banking on abortion. They were encouraging these states to have abortion initiatives on the ballot. And the idea was that you would go into the polling booth, particularly as women, and you would vote for the right to choose. And then while you were there, you would vote for Kamala Harris. And that's not what happened. I mean, it's a good thought. But what seems to have happened as we look at the exit polls is women did what a lot of Americans did, which is they said, yeah, I can do two things at once. I can go for this ballot initiative, support the right to choose. And you know what? Then I can also protect my economics by voting for change and Donald Trump. And so you have both of these things going on. And I think one of the big mistakes that both parties make, but the Democrats made it a lot here, is to assume that because you are a woman or because you are a Latino or because you are Black, you think and believe a certain way. And in doing that, they put aside how important the economy is for all voters and how important it is for people not to be feeling like they are getting quite, I'm sorry to say this, but screwed as they go into grocery shop or get gas and everything else. So, people were unhappy with this economy. It impacts all of us. Just because I'm a woman doesn't necessarily mean I cast that aside to save a right to choose. First election since the overturning of Roe. So we're just learning some of these lessons, but the assumptions are dead wrong, and it's stereotypes, and that's problematic. Democrats do it a lot.
Well, and it is worth pointing out while many states that had abortion on the ballot in this cycle did protect those rights, there were states that did not, including in Florida. The abortion amendment making the 60% threshold in that state, even though it did win the majority of the vote. But that points us to, Rick, that there were other things on the ballot, and that we did see some split ticketing, including potentially in a lot of these battleground Senate races. We know the Democrats won in Michigan and Wisconsin. We're still waiting to find out both Pennsylvania and Arizona. Right now in Pennsylvania, we're within 0.4 of a percentage point. Dave McCormick up, 98% of the votes in. In Arizona, not as much of the vote in. We're moving slower there, 69%, but Ruben Gallego is up on Kerry Lake by 2 points. Is there any chance that the person who is behind right now in those races is going to be able to pull out the victory?
Yes, I think probably more so because it's so much closer in Pennsylvania. As you point out, less outstanding, but 30,000 votes separate the two. And so the reality is there's a good chance, from what I can tell in the voting patterns, that McCormick's got a legitimate shot at being a United States Senator this year. A little trickier in Arizona. It's all sort of concentrated in one place, Maricopa County. Maricopa County, we know, takes a while to count their votes. They love to be the center of attention. Good news this year is there's no reporting of irregularities or corruption or anything like that. So I suspect that once we get a final count from Maricopa County, it'll be a settled case in Arizona. But I think there's an outside chance that Kerry Lake could overcome Ruben Gallego to become a senator, but much less so, only because it's a much bigger bogey. 2% of the vote is still, she's lagging behind. And she'd have to get a real big majority, over 60% of the outstanding votes in Maricopa, to be able to overtake that. So that's a heavy lift. We've seen it happen before, and maybe it will come in sort of the later ballots that absentees are done. But I would say just one thing: I don't think we should underestimate the habit of Trump voters to bullet vote, right? Especially the early voters who were, putting it on a ballot and sticking it in the mail. They may or may not vote a full ballot, and we've seen this kind of sort of split ticket voting in the past. Although the numbers don't add up, right? There are more votes for president in the state than there are for the Senate candidates.
We got a statement, by the way, from the Bob Casey campaign in Pennsylvania suggesting we could be headed for a recount here. As they write, quote, yesterday the vote margin shrunk by 50,000. This race is now within a half point. The threshold for automatic recounts in Pennsylvania, with tens of thousands more votes to be counted, we're committed to ensuring, as you would imagine the rest of the line here, it ends by saying Senator Casey will be reelected. I don't know how long that's going to take, Rick, but we could be talking about recounts within a couple of days here. Kayleigh, we've got a lot more to follow after our signature panel. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzana will be back with us in our second hour here on Balance of Power.
Indeed. And we also, while we're here on Balance of Power, have to keep track of the markets, because this is Bloomberg TV and radio. And obviously, we saw a massive move yesterday, that first day that we knew Donald Trump would be the 47th president of the United States. You're seeing some of those trends continue today. And Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle is following them for us. Abigail?
It is pretty incredible, Kayleigh, to see the gains that we do have for the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ. That S&P 500 up the better part of 1%. The NASDAQ up more than 1%. So after yesterday's big rally, the certainty that we're seeing, or the relief rally that we're seeing around the certainty of who the president-elect is, over the last 3 days, the S&P 500 up significantly, up the better part of 5%. That is the best 3-day stretch going back all the way to November of 2022. And again, having to do with certainty, but it also has to do with the Trump trade, the idea that taxes may be cut and tariffs and protectionist policy. So when we put this into the perspective, some pockets of that Trump trade may be reversed reversing a little bit today. But yesterday's gains for Donald Trump are really pretty impressive, shadowing, I should say, the 2016 gains, the S&P 500 up 2.5%. That's the best day after a presidential election ever. So investors really cheering that. The Russell 2000 up nearly 6%, Bitcoin higher. So this is the market's way of saying that they, too, are voting for Donald Trump, that they're happy that Donald Trump is the president-elect.
15 handle on the VIX. Abigail, are we getting a little too relaxed here, too comfortable?
Good question, Joe, because about a week ago, it was closer to a 22. And at that point, you had some investors playing for volatility, playing around the uncertainty, others hedging. Now, though, not all that nervous, investors not so nervous. What we do have up later today, if you can believe it, I feel as though it's really getting lost in the dust. Of course, the big Fed meeting, it's pretty much baked in, though, that they are going to cut by about 1/4 of a basis point. It's hard to imagine that they would throw some kind of a curveball, but into that meeting, we do see a reversal of yield coming in, also that dollar in. But yeah, that VIX at 15. Seems as though investors are back kind of just in the saddle of going along and happy.
Elbows up on the barrel. Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle. Thank you, Abigail. Reminds us, of course, less than an hour from now, we'll be in our special Fed coverage. Kayleigh, not only the announcement, but the news conference, which I'd be very curious to hear today. I don't know what Michael McKee has up his sleeve, but I suspect we could have some questions about politics.
Well, sure, and especially what the political outcomes mean for monetary policy outcomes. If we're looking down the barrel of potentially inflationary policy in a second Trump administration, that will impact, presumably, the trajectory of interest rates. And also, Chairman Powell might have some questions about his job security as he goes to the podium later today. There's a massive question about what the Fed will look like under Donald Trump.
Yeah, I thought Trump told us he was going to
mixed messages.
Keep him on board. The Business Week interview. We'll have a lot more ahead. Andy Smith from New Hampshire up next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, live from World Headquarters in New York. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kayleigh Lines. Thank you for joining us on this Thursday of Election Week. But it's not just any Thursday, Joe. It is also the Thursday we get a Federal Reserve decision, because we haven't gotten enough news this week. Let's add an expected 25 basis point rate cut onto it.
At least they didn't call the presidential race right at 2 o'clock. We were kind of thinking what we would do in that scenario here. But yes, less than an hour from now, about 50 minutes, we'll have the start of our special coverage here on Bloomberg TV and radio with the surveillance team that'll bring us through the announcement and the news conference. But of course, we're talking politics here. There's quite a bit of crossover, though, and I wonder, Kayleigh, to what extent Jay Powell will be asked about the election on Tuesday night. Looks like you're pointing to some breaking news.
Yeah, we're getting some news, keeping in mind we know the outcome of the presidency and that Republicans have retained the majority, or have earned the majority of the Senate. We have big questions, though, about the House, and we just got a call from the Associated Press about one of the House races here in New York that we were watching. This is the 4th district, where the incumbent Congressman Anthony D'Esposito has been defeated now, according to the Associated Press. The Democrat in that race, Laura Gillen, has had that race called for her. The margin, with 98% of the votes counted, is about 2 points. She earned 50.9% of that vote. D'Esposito, 49.1% of the vote. So this is important as we consider how tight the majority could be, no matter who wins the House and Senate, and the fact that the path does run from New York to California.
Well, Mr. D'Esposito is part of a trend here. As Democrats have, they had a largely losing night, managed to unwind some of the Republican gains from 2 years ago in New York State. Freshman Republicans Brandon Williams and Marcus Molinaro lost their seats. Now we add Anthony D'Esposito losing to Lauren Gillen in a race that was too close to call, remembering New York, Kayleigh, and California are going to determine who controls the House. Yeah,
we still have 34 House races to be called. Right now, the balance, 194 seats for Democrats, 207 for Republicans, and we're trying to get to 218 to understand a majority.
I will tell you, when we got to New York over the weekend for our election week here, I was struck by the number of ads being run by and for and against House Republicans in these races in the New York delegation. I think I saw more D'Esposito ads, Oppo ads, than anyone else. So this resonates for people who've been living around here, inundated with the commercials. You are now going to get some relief. We're joined right now from Washington ahead of our conversation with Andrew Smith at the University of New Hampshire Survey Center by Bloomberg's Saleha Mohsen, of course, the host of the Big Take DC podcast and political reporter in Washington, D.C. Saleha, it's great to have you. Welcome from our Washington bureau. I'd love to just start wide here. There's a big conversation about the transition that's already underway, and I'm sure you're plugged into it. But just your wide impressions, having had a couple of days to let the dust settle here in the Democrats' loss.
Well, we're hearing that the president will probably soon start looking at the lists that his transition co-chairs, Howard Lutnick and Linda McMahon, have been working on for him since August. I think he spent the first couple of days resting. He had been up for almost 2 days straight, like a lot of us, but he was making his final campaign calls. And here at Bloomberg, we are eagerly awaiting for some of the top economic policy positions to be announced.
Well, so as we consider those economic policy positions, Saleha, keeping in mind that it is Fed Day, what do we think about the composition of the Fed? We've had mixed messages from Donald Trump about whether or not he would still like to see Jerome Powell be chairman of the Fed. And then there's, of course, the regulatory question on Michael Barr, the vice chair of supervision.
Yeah, always mixed messages from politicians generally, but also President-elect Donald Trump. So, look, this is a decision that Trump does not need to deal with right now. He needs to fill thousands of government jobs. He will have obviously make the decision on his cabinet and those top posts. The positions for Fed chair and vice chair and other governor seats, they don't open up until 2026. So there's a bit of time for him to get his government in order before those decisions are made. And let's see if we hear after today's or this afternoon's Fed interest rate decision, if we see Trump hitting the social media airwaves to start talking about how Powell is performing.
Be another episode of The Apprentice, I suspect, as he fills out any number of positions in the cabinet and beyond. There's a lot of reporting today on the names that are being bandied about, beginning with Chief of Staff. Saleha, is this Susie Wiles' job if she wants it?
You know, it's way too soon to say. There is one man who is going to make those decisions. He has not weighed in, according to Bloomberg News reporting. So far, all of the names that are being floated and put out into the ether right now are names that have been out there for several months.
All right, Bloomberg's Saleha Mohsen, host of the Big Take DC podcast, which will have a new episode dropping today. Thank you so much. You can, of course, check that out wherever you get your podcasts, as she takes a closer look to the Fed on this Fed Day. But of course, it's a Fed Day that is within an election week, and we want to focus back on the results of that election. Joining us now is Andrew Smith. He is director of the Survey Center at the University of New Hampshire. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio, Andrew. If we look at New Hampshire specifically, it's a state that Kamala Harris won. There was some question earlier in the cycle as to whether or not a Democrat would be able to win New Hampshire if it were up for grabs for Donald Trump. But you also had a Republican winning the gubernatorial race. So net, what does that say about the state?
Well, it really shows that there is a difference between the president and the governor and other elected officials. They're the two people that have to basically be administrators. They're the chief executives of their respective electoral bases. And New Hampshire has a long tradition of electing Republicans and Democrats in opposite parties to those positions. So if you just go back in the last 20 years, John Lynch was a four-term popular governor here, a Democrat, even survived the 2010 Republican landslide. And Chris Sununu was able to do that. He was a Republican. He was able to survive the Democratic landslide in 2018 here. And so this year we have a Kelly Ayotte, former senator, pretty well known and liked within the state, was able to withstand the Trump win at the top of the ticket because she got a lot of that crossover vote from people that liked the way that Sununu governed. And I think governors in New Hampshire tend to govern in nonpartisan ways, much more focused on just making sure that the books balance, the taxes are kept low, and the economy's running.
Saw some interesting ticket splitting in New Hampshire. A lot of people expected to see it around the country. Andrew, of course, we base our assumptions on what we saw in the last election, but it actually took place there. Kelly Ayotte, the Republican former senator, won her race for governor of New Hampshire, even as Kamala Harris won at the top of the ticket. Is that just New Hampshire being New Hampshire?
I think there is a lot to be said for that, but you can see this across New England. Phil Scott wins again, a Republican winning in overwhelmingly Democratic New York. Charlie Baker would win in Massachusetts. Mitt Romney would win in Massachusetts. So I think there's something that goes on in Massachusetts or in New England, where you've got more mainstream Republicans, kind of more traditional Rockefeller Republicans, so to speak, are able to do well, even though the region and the state of New Hampshire are largely Democratic.
Well, so as we consider the wider region and the tighter margins we are seeing in 2024 for the victors, at least at the presidential level, when you compare what Biden did in 2020 against Trump to what Harris did against Trump this time around, I wonder if you think which of those is more indicative of the way things are going to go in the future, I guess? Was it just 2020 was a super high turnout election? There were higher vote tallies in total, and that ultimately that turnout is what made the difference? Or does this suggest that we might see more repetitions of 2024 in that the margins are getting tighter and tighter and tighter?
I think you could see both. I think actually that 2020 was a record outcome for turnout. We haven't seen turnout like that. It was even more than the 1960 election, which has always been seen in the modern times as the highest turnout election. I don't think we'll see that again. Remember, that was in the midst of COVID, midst of Trump's kind of Trump was being impeached at that time. A lot of motivation from Republicans and Democrats to get out. This is still high turnout this year, but it's probably more down around the 60 to 62% turnout when we get all the final numbers in, which I think it's high, but more likely to be a typical sort of a turnout as we'll see going forward.
Well, boy, there's a lot to consider here when it comes to your view in New Hampshire. I would just love your impressions broadly here as we look at the country. Andrew, you've been in the polling business for a long time, and there's said to be a reckoning after every election, and I wonder what it should be this time. Undersampling Trump, tweaking the sample to reach more people who don't have landlines, young people who don't like talking to pollsters. How are people in your industry approaching this new frontier?
1,000 flowers are blooming is what I would start off with. The whole polling industry has been going through a paradigm shift in methodology for the last 5 years plus, similar to what happened in the time between the 1960s and 1970s when we moved from in-person surveys to telephone surveys. Those worked very well until the later part of the 2000s, when we saw response rates really plummet, where we're getting only about 5% response rates in telephone surveys. That makes them very, very expensive then, and web surveys certainly much less expensive. And since that time, us and many other organizations have been experimenting with these different technologies and figuring out best practices to use web surveys. We're going to be going forward to web surveys, whether we like it or not, because the cost difference is so great. We as an industry are going to be looking at this very carefully to see what methodologies were most accurate in predicting the elections, which didn't work, and hopefully be able to have a more unified front, I guess, going up to the 2028 elections. I should say, though, generally speaking, the polls performed quite well in this election, despite of all the problems that we spoke about.
Well, and that's true when you kind of look across the board, not just at the presidential race. And as we look ahead to 2028, I do wonder, Andrew, if ultimately this was mostly about Donald Trump consistently being underpolled, whether that was because of the way voters felt comfortable expressing their support or lack thereof of him or what have you. But I wonder how much of these challenges are unique to this particular candidate who's about to start a second term. That's all he's constitutionally allowed. He's not going to be on the ballot again in 28.
Well, I'd say, first of all, the methodological challenges that we face in industry are going to continue. That said, the undercount, or what we would call the partisan non-response that seemed to hide some Republican votes over the last several cycles, that may go away in a non-Trump era. One of the things that I've seen in the research that I've been doing is that Republicans were less likely to do things such as put a yard sign in front of their yard, or put a bumper sticker on their car because they were afraid their car was going to be vandalized, or even talk about their support for Trump to families, coworkers, friends, whoever. So there was a reticence on the part of Trump supporters to not support him. And this fits in with a sociological theory called the spiral of silence theory. which says that people are less likely to talk with a pollster, but they're still going to vote for their candidate eventually. So this may be heightened because of Trump, but we may see this going on forward. I think it's something that we as researchers are going to be paying a lot of attention to.
Andrew, I mentioned your governor-elect, Kelly Ayotte. What about the governor about to leave the building? Chris Sununu threw all of his chips on Nikki Haley and has been twisting himself into a pretzel in some cases to try to justify his support for Donald Trump. What's in his future? Is it even in politics?
I think he has a future in politics. He's quite young. He was considering actually running for president himself in 2024. I think that he's got that in his future to come. I think the problem that any governor has, any party member, is it's very, very difficult to cross paths with the person who's at the top of the ticket. I had an old colleague here in New Hampshire who was the chair of the Republican Party back during the 1970s. He says it comes down to it. If you're a member of the party, this is your team. You have to support everybody up and down the ticket on your team and rationalize it why your skunk is better than the other party's skunk.
It's great to have you back with us here on Bloomberg, Andrew, director of the University of New Hampshire Survey Center. That's Andrew Smith joining us from the Granite State. Kaylee, we have a little bit of breaking news, at least CNN does, that pertains to a conversation we were just having about Jay Powell's future tenure or not, remembering that Donald Trump told us that he would allow Jay Powell to serve out his term as chair of the Fed, which runs through May of 2026 when he sat down with Bloomberg Business Week over the summer. Now he's saying something similar to CNN. Yeah, he's essentially confirming that he will indeed let him serve out the remainder of his term, at least according to CNN's reporting. But then what happens after May 2026, of course, is an open question, keeping in mind that someone very close to Trump who is advising him on economic policy, Scott Bessent, has advocated for what would effectively be a shadow Fed chair, that you nominate someone and get them confirmed potentially early before the term is up, which of course has had a lot of criticism inspired by those who watch this space. Questions. In fact, we asked him about that last time he joined us at the table here, about the extent to which that would neutralize the actual Fed chair and their authority. This may well come up, I suspect, during the news conference after today's Fed meeting. And in 35 minutes, our special Fed coverage will be here on Bloomberg TV and radio with a 2 o'clock decision in the offing. We'll have much more ahead on Balance of Power as we count down to that decision at 2 p.m. Wall Street time. Joined next hour by Bloomberg Opinion's Catherine Edwards on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power.
From Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York City to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. We are 1 hour from a Federal Reserve rate decision, and we are 1 day from the day the world learned that Donald Trump will be the 47th president of the United States. Still many questions out there, Joe, including the size of the Republican majority in the Senate, whether it will be a Republican or Democratic majority in the House. But one thing we know for sure is Chairman Powell is going to take the podium about an hour and a half from now. That's right. Knowing there is a new political reality in the U.S. of A. That's true. And of course, our special coverage will start before then, about a half hour from now, 1:30 p.m. Wall Street time. From right here in Manhattan, the surveillance crew will bring this to you on Bloomberg TV and radio with a 2 p.m. announcement. The news conference that could be quite political. A lot of questions, as CNN now reports, the same as Bloomberg Business Week did over the summer, that Donald Trump does plan to keep Jay Powell on the job. But to your point, Kaylee, we do still have voting to follow here and votes to count. The House has not been called. About 24 House races, a little more than that, are still outstanding, and we're waiting for Senate races to be called in some pretty important states. Pennsylvania, Nevada, Arizona. That Pennsylvania race could end up in a recount. Yeah, the margin is incredibly tight right now between the incumbent Democrat Bob Casey, who is currently lagging former Bridgewater executive Dave McCormick by about 0.4 percentage points. Margins are tight, as we knew they would be, though, of course, the margin in the outcome of the presidential race much wider than initially expected, with what looks to be a landslide victory for Donald Trump in a sweep of the 7 swing states, though Nevada and Arizona have yet to be called.
Yep, that's absolutely right. Joining us now from Washington, D.C. is Bloomberg's Gregory Cordy. Gregory, it's great to have you with us. Thanks for joining. As we look toward the future here, we're spending some time looking to the past. We heard from Joe Biden earlier today as he addressed people in the Rose Garden, spoke to the nation about the results on Tuesday night, and he did reach out to Donald Trump. Let's listen to what he said.
Yesterday, I spoke with President-elect Trump to congratulate him on his victory, and I assured him that I'd direct my entire administration to work with his team to ensure a peaceful and orderly transition.
Gregory, it seems that Democrats' primary mission now, before unpacking the results and reforming the party and its message, is being deliberate about showing what a peaceful transfer of power should be. Is that right?
Yeah, the line that we heard from the president today, and it's a line that we've heard from him in speeches about democracy during the campaign when he was still a candidate and through his presidency, is that you can't love America only when you win, right? And that was delivered throughout the campaign as an indictment of former president, now president-elect Donald Trump, who famously sent a mob to the U.S. Capitol in an attempt to try to overturn the results of the election, railed against crooked elections, a fixed election. And here is Joe Biden intentionally trying to convey a more gracious tone to practice what he preaches and to say, look, the voters have spoken. It was a pretty convincing Trump victory. And now his job and his constitutional responsibility, as he said, is to make sure that there is a peaceful transition of power from now through January 20th, when President-elect Trump will take the oath of office.
Well, so even if this administration is willing to cooperate with the next one, Gregory, I do wonder if there still could be some bumps in the road, in that Donald Trump has expressed a great deal of skepticism around, say, the General Services Administration, which usually, of course, plays a big role in facilitating this, with the intelligence community, which would have a hand in ensuring there are background checks done on all of those who would be incoming into this administration. What kind of difficulty could that skepticism cause?
Yeah, remember 4 years ago, even before January 6th, there was a lot of friction between the Trump and Biden camps, with the Biden transition accusing the Trump administration of really sort of foot dragging on the transition. There's been some changes. The Congress passed some amendments to what's called the Presidential Transition Act a couple of years ago, which should streamline this kind of thing. And the biggest issue now that we don't have is we don't have two different candidates contesting claiming victory right now. So we know that President-elect Trump will be the next president. He's been president before. So whereas, in 2016 when he was elected, he was really starting from scratch, trying to put together a team, understand sort of what roles he even had to fill. There's a thing called the Plum Book, which lists every political appointment in the administration that presidents have to fill. Trump knows how to do that now. He has people. It presumably will be a less rocky transition. But I agree with you. I think President Trump will try to go it alone, not seek the help of the Biden administration for the transition if he can at all avoid it.
Bloomberg's Gregory Cordy. Gregory, thank you for the time and the insights. As we turn to our signature political panel, Rick Davis is here, partner at Stone Court Capital, Republican strategist. Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Great to have you both with us. Last hour, I asked Jeannie if Joe Biden deserved the blame he's getting. I'd like to ask you a slightly different question, Rick, because you worked with Joe Biden in your career in the Senate quite a lot. He knew John McCain very well. And I wonder, as the legacy building begins here, while he's in a tough spot, how will he be remembered?
Usually, history treats former presidents better every year you're outside of office. And I think that there's no question that he accomplished a lot legislatively in his term of office. Trillions of dollars of spending to, supercharge the economy. He's handing over a very robust, healthy economy to Donald Trump. So that's a real plus for him, right? Even though he won't get credit for it politically, right? It's obviously not something that Kamala Harris could take advantage of in the campaign. But I think his failures are foreign policy, right? Which is exactly the opposite of what most people would have thought, right? That his stewardship
he wanted to be the America's backed president.
Right, exactly. And so, it's unfortunate for him, but I think that's the cross he'll have to bear. I mean, the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan will haunt him for eternity.
Well, so, Jeannie, as we consider that, the kind of world that exists now when Joe Biden leaves office with ongoing wars in multiple theaters, there's also the question, and Rick was just alluding to this, of whether the accomplishments that he likes to herald are going to be lasting. When he spoke from the Rose Garden, he was talking about legislative accomplishments, alluding to the likes of the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act, things that Republicans are talking about peeling back if they get power back. And it looks like they very well could in the House after winning the Republican majority in the Senate. So the things that Biden wants to be remembered for, are they actually going to last in the U.S.?
Yeah, it's such an important point because, of course, Donald Trump, the Republicans now come in with a mandate, and they have been very, very clear throughout this campaign on what they intend to do. And to your point, a lot of that is focused on peeling back what the Democrats and Joe Biden put into place. And that's one of the reasons, quite frankly, they got a lot of support, particularly as it pertains to regulation. So I do think we're going to see an effort here. And that's why, of course, what happens in the House still unresolved at this point is so important, and why the size of the majority that the Republicans have in the Senate, and if that changes much with these last few races, and the size that whoever wins has in the House matters so much. You know, you just point to one example. You've got Elon Musk saying he's going to cut trillions of dollars in what he describes as wasteful spending. That's not going to happen if either Democrats have the House or Republicans retain it by a very narrow majority, because it's going to be difficult there. And then, of course, to pass the filibuster in the Senate. So those majorities are going to matter. But in a larger perspective, that is what Donald Trump has told us he intends to do. And this impacts everything from energy to, as you mentioned, the CHIPS Act. They've even talked about, we heard Mike Johnson talking about the Affordable Care Act. So all of that is going to be on the table. And all of these things that Joe Biden was just talking about in the Rose Garden as big, successes for him, and I agree they're big successes. Many of them are in danger of being repealed, but it's going to start with whatever Donald Trump can do via EO, because those things are the things he will tackle first. The other things are going to be a little bit more difficult for him to do unilaterally.
Joe Biden said today in the Rose Garden, "You're hurting. I hear you and I see you. Don't forget all that we've accomplished." What does that tell you as we prepare to hear from the Fed? Current state of the economy, interest rates. He would point to inflation, I suspect, as an accomplishment. While they didn't finish the job, they got it down to 2.1%. I know that every news release says there's more work to be done, but he's got to have this in the back of his head as Jay Powell prepares to hit the podium today, that we came this close to closing the deal on this.
Yeah, I think that the only thing that would actually prove that he closed the deal was the election of Kamala Harris on the fact that their stewardship of the economy was good. So he's going to never have that to think about as far as a legacy item. But the facts are there, right? So historians write the history. It's not what actually we experience. And I suspect he'll get a decent write-up on his stewardship of the economy. I remember sitting at this desk talking about how a recession was almost a certainty 2 years ago, right? And so, he steered us through those troubled waters, and he should get credit for that.
Yeah, this White House loves to remind us here at Bloomberg about a recession call from about that long ago that was projected with 100% certainty. Hasn't yet materialized. But Rick, when we consider then future stewardship of the economy, everything Donald Trump has promised, and we were speaking in the last hour with Congressman Carlos Gimenez, a Republican from Florida, about this. There is a lot he says he wants to do when it comes to deregulation, when it comes to tax cuts and supplementing those tax cuts with income from tariffs. If we were to consider all of it together, how likely is it that the majority of Donald Trump's campaign promises turn into actual reality?
Yeah, look, I think that it's not a purity thing, right? I mean, like, there are going to be aspects of all the things that he talked about turned into legislative or executive proposals that get acted on. It's not going to be 100% of everything you do. Ronald Reagan had this great line. He's like, I'm going to demand 100%, but I'll settle for 80. And I think Donald Trump gets it, right? He is a deal guy at his heart. And a success is a success, whether it's 70, 80, 90% of what he wanted. He has the incredible benefit of having been delivered a great economy when he was first elected in 2016 after a global financial crisis in 2008. And now he has this, the great benefit of getting a terrific economy handed to him after, pandemic. So he has, the stars have aligned for him. And I wouldn't underestimate Republicans looking at this and saying, here's an enormous opportunity to cement a durable majority for a long time. The last thing we want to do is overspend, or overextend the government efforts to let the economy grow. And by the way, I think part of that role is going to be Elon Musk's whispering in Donald Trump's ear, deficits matter.
Well, I know that you're not a big fan of that idea with Elon Musk working with the future administration, Jeannie, but I wonder some of the other names that are being floated right now. Everybody's got a short list at the moment as Donald Trump has to build out a cabinet. John Paulson's name is floated, as well as Scott Bessent for Treasury Secretary. Both of them have been on Bloomberg talking about this in the last couple of weeks. Joe Lavorgna, who was with us on the program, sat at the table here yesterday being floated for chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. How do these names make a Democrat feel?
I think Democrats are feeling like they have to be the opposition party that they have now found themselves in. And again, it depends on what happens in the House, but certainly they feel like they have to watch very carefully. I mean, for many Democrats, one of the things that was so frightening to them as they thought about a potential Trump presidency was Project 2025. And as you look at that 900-page document, which, of course, Donald Trump has said he is not a part of and has nothing to do with his campaign or now his upcoming presidency, there are a lot of proposals in there, including economic, which send shivers up the backs of many Democrats. So they are going to have to be the loyal opposition watching and taking exception to steps that the president and the administration, Republicans in D.C. may take that they find objectionable. And I would just say, I think, by the way, Elon Musk, one of my favorite topics of the last few weeks, he's got a big challenge on his hands to cut that much if he has either a Democratic House or a Republican maintaining a very narrow lead. He's done beautifully in the private sector, but the public sector is something different. So as much as I may not like it, it's going to be fascinating to watch.
Well, one of the proposals, at least in the area where we are right now, that might be popular is the lifting of the SALT cap, which Donald Trump had promised. And we were wondering how that might resonate here in New York in the House races that ultimately could have a hand in deciding the majority. And other than Mike Lawler, the incumbent Republicans that were seen at risk, Rick, have lost their races. The AP just within the last hour called the Despacito race for his Democratic opponent, Laura Gillen. Marcus Molinaro lost his reelect, as did Brandon Williams. We obviously have a lot outstanding in the West, California specifically. So is New York something that could be an example of how the rest of that is going to go, or is this an outlier?
I think New York and in some cases, depending upon the district, California are outliers, right? We did extremely, really Republicans did extremely well in the midterm in New York and California. These weren't historically red districts, and I would have anticipated some losses, especially in those two. But the reality is Republicans do look poised to take control of the House of Representatives with these losses. I mean, it's literally 3 of the 4 losses that Republicans have taken in New York for the rest of the country. So there is a lot of resiliency with this Republican majority. It won't be big, as Jeannie says. I mean, at best, I think 223 seats would probably become the Republican majority, which takes us right back, deja vu all over again.
Yeah.
Pretty much where we started the year, at the beginning of the Biden administration.
Jeannie, Donald Trump told CNN today, same thing he told Bloomberg Businessweek a couple of months ago, that he does plan to keep Jay Powell on the job. Remembering, of course, he tapped him to begin with. Was it the right decision?
I think it is, first of all, his term, as you've talked about so many times, isn't ending. This notion that you talked to Scott Bassett about this shadow chair, that doesn't resonate with many people. I think you've got to give Powell credit where we are today in the economy. He has shepherded that. And I think Donald Trump is very, very conscious of the fact that he is, as Rick just mentioned, inheriting a very good economy. And while he has publicly taken exception to Powell many times, it is now his economy. He owns it. So I think it is a smart decision not to try to take on Powell at this point or make any changes there, which again, would be difficult for him to make without, something happening that would allow him to charge malfeasance of some kind. So it is a decision that makes sense, and it reiterates what he has said in the past.
Are we still going to see, though, frequent tweets or Truth Social posts or whatever at this time around Fed decisions and the push to cut rates at every turn, Rick?
Well,
we experienced this last time.
He is a major shareholder with billions of equity in Truth Social. So I would imagine he will feed the beast from time to time. I mean, it's in his self-interest to do it. But already we're seeing a little bit more structure to the run-up to his transition, including this announcement today that he would expect Jay Powell to see his way through the end of his term. I think you could have bet a month ago that tweet could have looked much different. Yeah. And I'm quite confident that he'll probably spend more time on X than he has throughout the campaign because, of course, his new best friend is going to insist upon it.
Did you see this, though, Kayleigh, on X? David Plouffe has deleted his account, according to Jackie Heinrich. I wonder if we see more Democrats make that choice and this becomes a more partisan platform. That's something you foresee?
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, Elon Musk has made it a more partisan platform. Yeah. It's the way he wants it. And so if he's making a bet on politics and where the majority of users will be, that's his risk.
Wow. Jeannie, we've got like 10 seconds. Are you going to stay on X?
Huh.
I am barely on X, but I'm going to stay on. I enjoy telling you and Joe what I see and sending you little things. So I'm there, Kayleigh.
All right, Jeannie Shanzino.
She's on Truth Social.
And Rick Davis, our signature political panel. Thank you. We have much more ahead here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thanks for joining us on the fastest show in politics. Today, the shortest in recent memory as well as we prepare for special Fed coverage. That's about 10 minutes from now. The Bank of England beat us to it, cutting interest rates for the second time only since 2020. We got a 0.25 percentage point cut. Bank's Governor Andrew Bailey commented on Donald Trump's win in his news conference after.
Look about the U.S. election. Can I just make this point? First of all, we always respond to announced policies, and that's true in the world, it's true in the UK, not to, stories about what they might be. So we're not going to respond to anything. The second thing I'll make, just to be very clear on this, we work with all U.S. administrations.
I wonder if we're going to get some similar language from Fed Chair Jay Powell when he takes the podium just over 1 hour from now. So joining us with more as we look ahead to the decision and the press conference is Catherine Edwards of Bloomberg Opinion. So, Catherine, we have a lot we could ask you about the election and what influence, if any, it will have on Fed policy. But if we could just begin with the policy itself. You have Elizabeth Warren this week pushing for another 50 basis point Fed cut. The market is expecting 25 basis points. And there are others who are suggesting this economy might not need another cut right now at all. Where do you come down?
I mean, the last jobs report was low enough, even with the data concerns from the hurricane and the strike, that I would be shocked if they didn't cut rates at least 0.25 point.
At least 0.25 point. Are we in a world in which we could see 50? That's what some Democratic senators, including Elizabeth Warren, no surprise, are calling for.
I would be surprised if they went that high. I mean, 0.25 is what they baked in. They like sticking to expectations, and what the economy needs almost always is steadiness and predictability to a certain degree. So being able to look at the data, see that we had a weak jobs report, but an okay GDP report, stay on track for continuing to reduce rates at a steady clip, I think is what they'll do.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to ask something about Elizabeth Warren really quickly before we continue our discussion on the Fed, because the Republicans obviously have earned the Senate majority. That's going to make Senator Tim Scott the chair of the Banking Committee. But when you look at the senior members of the Banking Committee on the Democratic side, Mark Warner and Jack Reed likely to be ranking members on other committees. That could mean Elizabeth Warren is the next ranking member of the Banking Committee, helping to lead the inquisition of whoever the Fed chair is biannually on Capitol Hill or semi-annually. And I just wonder if she has a greater role in the Senate in defining banking policy, what impact ultimately that could have, knowing that she does tend to be much more liberal in her ideas.
She's a firm regulator, and that's, she was a lawyer and a professor for some time, but she, really made her mark in so many ways of being part of the auditor of the TARP funds, if we can all go back to that very unpleasant time in economic history. And she has proven to be very effective at being a regulator and overseer, even though she is now a senator. So I would not be surprised if she took it, and she... the point of these Senate committees is not just to set policy, but also to set standards and to set oversight. And, you can't be so mad at a regulator if you're following all the rules. So if people are upset that she comes into power, it does make me wonder why they're so upset on some level, if I could be a little tongue-in-cheek towards them.
Yes, you are. You're allowed to. A little TARP nostalgia with Catherine Edwards. It's interesting here to consider what we're going to learn today in the news conference, Catherine. And I don't know what you would be asking Jay Powell, but I suspect we're going to hear about Donald Trump's victory this week, what it will mean for his tenure. What do you think he'll tell us?
I'm not sure. I mean, he has been trying to avoid politics for a long time. I think he'll echo what we heard from the head of the Bank of England earlier, that they don't respond to claims or pronouncements. It's when a policy has been announced and enacted that they adjust their policy making. So, I mean, we just went through a campaign that has more than a usual amount of bluster, but he doesn't really have a lot to go on other than, in about 2 months, he'll have a new president.
Well, and that new president has, to your point, whether it's bluster or not, made a lot of promises on the campaign trail, including that for higher tariffs, potentially across the board, at the very least, higher tariffs on countries where the U.S. imports a lot of goods from, Catherine. And I wonder if ultimately, if enacted, that's going to bring this entire cutting cycle for the Federal Reserve to a premature end.
To the extent that he actually pursues the tariff policy, I think the Fed would have to work around it because the impact on prices could potentially be devastating. The job of the central bank to keep prices low would be made much more difficult if import prices, especially import prices for U.S. producers, were to climb as much as they would under a blanket 20% tariff. They are no doubt, in behind the scenes looking into how this policy would play out, which industries would be most affected. I wouldn't doubt that they're not planning for it right now, but that doesn't mean that they're counting on it occurring or that they would already act as if it has started.
Well, Catherine, we're hearing a lot about animal spirits on Wall Street since Tuesday night, and I don't have to tell you about the reaction that we've seen, certainly in the stock market, has been powerful. What do you think Donald Trump will mean for our economy?
It's unclear. I think that presidents often get too much credit for the bills that come due and the investments that start to return that were enacted by people in the office long before them. I mean, it's a $20 trillion colossus of an economy. You don't really get to control it with a wave of your hand, even if you are the president of the United States. He's inheriting an economy that's basically been given a second chance. So many people thought when the 2024 election happened, we'd be in a recession or trying to come out of one. So we've got a second chance for the economy, and it's been handed to him. He's only the second president since Ronald Reagan to take office not in a recession. It's him and H.W. Bush. So that's a gift. That's lucky in a lot of ways, and I would hope that he doesn't squander it. But as for the rest of economic policy, I don't think I would be, radical in saying that he's not exactly a man that can be taken at his word. And that there is a lot of bluster to campaigns. A lot of what he's proposed is pretty detrimental. I think, if anything, the only thing that we can count on is that Republicans will probably use this opportunity to pass another $4 trillion tax cut to devastate the kind of current fiscal state of the U.S. government. And that's probably all we can count on at this point, is just another tax cut.
So you think he'll be devastating, is what I'm hearing. Catherine Edwards, thank you for joining us. Find her work on the terminal and online at Bloomberg Opinion. And we always appreciate the insights, certainly ahead of a Fed meeting. This is it, Kaylee.
Yep.
We'll hand things over in just a moment to our colleagues for special Fed coverage, and we'll be back on the late edition of Balance of Power at 5 o'clock to unpack what we heard.
Yeah, again, it's expected to be a 25 basis point rate cut, but it's really the press conference where we could see a lot of news made on the Fed's path forward, given some of the economic policies put forward by the president-elect. And of course, we'll wait for political questions as well. That's it for Joe and I. A special edition of Bloomberg Surveillance, The Fed Decides, with Jonathan Farrow, Lisa Abramowitz, and Tom Keene will start right after this on Bloomberg TV and radio.